The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, and Daniel Carter stepped inside, the bright fluorescent lights of the high-end department store momentarily blinding him. The place was sleek, modern, rows of expensive coats, suits, and high-priced leather boots displayed like trophies behind glass. The store smelled of polished wood, designer cologne, and money. Daniel wasn't a man of luxury. He never had been. But the cold outside had been biting, and after weeks of trying to stretch his worn-out jacket through the season, he had finally given in. He needed something warm, durable, something that wouldn't fall apart like everything else in his life seemed to, these days. He adjusted the strap of his faded duffel, the same one he had carried since his days in the Marine Corps, and moved deeper into the store. He wasn't in a hurry, walking with the quiet purpose of a man who had spent his life measuring his steps carefully. Behind the counter, Rick Mathers, the store's security guard, leaned lazily against the glass display case. He was built like a bouncer, broad shoulders, bald head, a permanent sneer on his face. His job was simple: keep an eye on the merchandise, stop anyone who looked like trouble. And trouble, as far as Rick was concerned, had just walked in. Rick's eyes locked onto Daniel, and instantly his lip curled. The guy looked like he didn't belong. His jacket was old, his boots worn. He wasn't like the businessmen who came in flashing credit cards, or the well-dressed women who walked in with their designer handbags. To Rick, Daniel looked like a nobody. Daniel moved to a rack near the back, running his fingers over the fabric of a heavy-duty winter coat. It was perfect, thick, insulated, the kind of thing that could take on brutal winters. He checked the price tag, more than he wanted to spend, but he could manage. Just as he was about to pull the coat from the rack, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. Daniel's body reacted before his mind did. Years of training had wired him to anticipate a threat before it fully arrived. His muscles tensed, ready to move, ready to counter, but he held himself back. He turned slowly. Rick stood there, his grip firm, his smirk ugly. "You lost, old man?" Rick asked, his voice thick with condescension. Daniel held his gaze, calm but unreadable. "Just looking." Rick let out a dry chuckle. "Yeah, looking for what? Somewhere to warm up?" He glanced down at Daniel's boots, the scuffed leather, the miles they had seen. "We don't do charity here, Grandpa." A few customers nearby turned to watch, sensing the shift in the air. A couple of sales associates at the front counter exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. Daniel let out a slow breath, keeping his temper in check. "I'm here to buy a coat." Rick raised an eyebrow. "You serious?" He glanced toward the cashier, then back at Daniel. "You got the money for that?" Daniel felt it then, the sharp sting of something he had grown all too familiar with, the assumption, the judgment, the belief that a man like him, dressed the way he was, couldn't possibly belong here. He could have walked away, could have let it go, could have left the store and taken his business elsewhere, but he was tired of walking away. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. He didn't say anything, just held it up, flipping it open so Rick could see the stack of bills inside. Rick's smirk faltered for just a second. Daniel didn't need to prove anything to this man, but he did it anyway, because some people only understood money. Rick scoffed, covering his momentary slip with another sneer. "Look, pal, we've had people like you come in before. You say you're shopping, but then you start lingering, loitering." Daniel's patience thinned. "People like me?" Rick rolled his eyes. "You know what I mean, guys who don't belong in places like this." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. The weight of them hit differently. Daniel had heard a lot of things in his life. Some things he let slide, some things he couldn't. This question mark, this was one of those things. He squared his shoulders, his stance shifting slightly. Not aggressive, but unmovable. "I served 22 years in the Marine Corps," Daniel said, his voice calm but sharp. "I fought in 2 wars, lost more friends than I can count, and spent my life making sure people like you had the freedom to run your mouth without consequences." Rick's smirk vanished. Daniel took a slow step closer. Not a threat, just a presence. "Now, I came in here to buy a damn coat," he said. "So either you let me do that, or you get the hell out of my way." For a split second, Rick hesitated. There was something dangerous in Daniel's eyes. Not the kind of danger that came from recklessness, but the kind that came from experience. But Rick was too arrogant to back down. His smirk returned, but this time it looked forced. "Nah," Rick said, shaking his head. "I don't think so." Before Daniel could respond, Rick reached forward and shoved him hard. It happened so fast, the gasps from the onlookers barely registered. Daniel stumbled back slightly, his body tensed, his instincts screaming to react. But then, before he could make a move, before anyone else could even process what had happened, a voice cut through the tension, loud, authoritative, commanding. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The entire store froze. Rick turned, his face shifting from smugness to panic in an instant. Standing near the entrance, James Harrington had just stepped inside. A man dressed in a tailored suit, silver-haired, with an air of authority that couldn't be ignored. Daniel recognized the look immediately, the posture, the command in his tone. This wasn't just some random bystander, this was a man who had worn the uniform. Rick took a half step back, suddenly unsure of himself. "Sir, I was just..." Harrington cut him off. "I saw what you did." His voice was cold, sharp, undeniable. The silence in the store was deafening. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. Because whatever was about to happen next, it was going to change everything. Rick's face drained of color. The moment James Harrington stepped forward, the entire energy in the store shifted. Customers, employees, everyone was watching. The man commanded attention without even trying, his tailored suit barely disguising the military bearing that hadn't faded despite the years. His voice was steady, authoritative, the kind of tone that demanded obedience before a man even realized he was following an order. Rick swallowed hard, suddenly aware that he had stepped into something much bigger than himself. "Sir, he started, but Harrington wasn't interested in excuses. "You assaulted a veteran," Harrington said, his voice like steel, threw him out of a store he had every right to be in. He took another step forward, and Rick flinched. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Rick tried to recover, straightening his posture, but there was no confidence left in his stance. "Look, I was just doing my job, keeping the place safe." Harrington scoffed. "Safe? From what? A Marine with more honor in his little finger than you'll have in your entire miserable life?" His sharp blue eyes burned into Rick, sizing him up the way an officer sizes up a weak recruit on his first day of training. "You humiliated a man who served this country, and for what? Because you thought he didn't belong?" Rick's mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence stretched, suffocating. Daniel hadn't moved since the moment Harrington had stepped in, but now he slowly adjusted his coat, watching as the weight of the situation crushed the man who had put hands on him. He wasn't the kind of man who needed someone to fight his battles for him, but there was something deeply satisfying about seeing Rick finally realize just how badly he had messed up. And the rest of the store was watching too. The cashier, a young woman in her 20s, looked mortified. The two salesmen near the fitting rooms wouldn't even make eye contact. The other customers, some of whom had just been standing around moments ago, doing nothing, were now whispering among themselves, shaking their heads in disgust. Rick had thought he was in control. Now he was the one being judged. Harrington turned slightly, looking toward the store manager, a balding man in a pressed white shirt and a name tag that read Gordon. The poor guy had been lurking near the back of the store the entire time, clearly unsure of how to handle what was unfolding before him. "Is this how you run your store?" Harrington asked, his voice cold as ice. Gordon gulped. No, sir, Harrington raised a hand. "Save it." He turned back to Rick, his expression unreadable. "How long have you worked here?" Rick shifted uncomfortably. Couple of years." "Good," Harrington said. "Then you'll understand why you're no longer employed here." The words landed like a hammer. Rick's face twisted with shock. "Wait, what?" "You heard me?" Harrington said. "I happen to own the company that runs this chain of stores. And let me tell you something. I don't tolerate this kind of garbage." Rick's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since Daniel had stepped inside, he had nothing to say. "You can collect your things and leave," Harrington continued. "And if I ever hear about you treating another veteran, or any human being for that matter, the way you did today, I'll make sure you don't find work anywhere that requires more than pushing a mop." Rick stood there, frozen, humiliated, ruined. The store was so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. The weight of the moment was suffocating. And then, from somewhere in the store, someone clapped. Just one at first, then another, and then, suddenly, the store erupted into applause. A couple of customers nodded at Daniel, tipping their heads in respect. The young cashier behind the counter looked like she wanted to cry. The blonde sales associate near the registers looked angry. Angry that it had happened, but relieved that it had been made right. Rick's face turned red as he stormed toward the back of the store, his heavy boots stomping against the polished tile. And just like that, he was gone. Harrington exhaled, his shoulders relaxing just slightly as he turned back to Daniel. "Sergeant Carter," he said, his voice carrying the formal tone of a man who understood respect. "I'd like to personally apologize for what just happened here." Daniel nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Appreciate it," he said, voice calm but firm. Harrington studied him for a moment before gesturing toward the racks of coats. "Anything you want in this store? It's on me." Daniel stiffened slightly. "That's not necessary." "I insist," Harrington said, "not because I pity you, but because men like you deserve to be treated with respect." Daniel hesitated, but there was something genuine in Harrington's gaze. This wasn't charity. This wasn't a handout. It was a matter of principle. Finally, Daniel gave a small nod. "All right then." Harrington smiled slightly. "Good. Let's get you taken care of." The tension in the store broke completely. Employees moved quickly, bringing Daniel the best winter coats in the store. A young salesman, one who had stayed silent earlier but clearly regretted it now, personally helped Daniel try on a few options. When Daniel finally chose one, a black military-grade winter coat, sturdy enough to last years, Harrington personally took it to the register, refusing to let anyone else process the transaction. By the time Daniel walked out of the store, his new coat slung over his shoulders, the air felt different. He had come in expecting nothing more than a simple purchase. Instead, he had walked out with his dignity reinforced, and a reminder that not everyone had forgotten what men like him had sacrificed. And Rick? He had learned the hard way that disrespecting a veteran could cost you everything. Because sometimes, karma doesn't take its time. Sometimes, it hits back immediately. Daniel stepped out into the cold air, his breath visible in the winter chill. His new coat was heavy on his shoulders, the thick lining already shielding him from the wind that had been cutting through his old tattered jacket just an hour ago. But the weight wasn't just from the fabric, it was from everything that had happened inside that store. He adjusted the strap of his duffel bag, feeling the warmth of the store still lingering on his skin. He had spent years being overlooked, treated as an invisible man, another veteran struggling to find his place in a world that had moved on without him. But tonight had been different. As he took his first step toward the parking lot, a voice called out behind him. "Sergeant Carter, wait!" He turned to see James Harrington stepping outside, his breath puffing in the cold air, hands tucked into the pockets of his expensive wool coat. His posture was as straight as ever, his presence just as commanding. Daniel stopped, watching as the man approached. Harrington stopped a few feet away, studying him for a moment, as if deciding how to word what he was about to say. Then, with the quiet authority of a man who had spent his life making tough calls, he spoke. "I meant what I said in there," Harrington said. "Men like you deserve better than what you got tonight." Daniel gave a small nod. "Appreciate that." Harrington hesitated, then let out a breath. "I don't just mean in that store. I mean out here, in this country. We send our men to fight wars, ask them to give up everything for the promise that they'll be taken care of when they come home. And then we let them slip through the cracks." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, the words hitting him harder than he expected, because they were true. Harrington went on, "I've seen men come back and get left behind. I watch good soldiers, men who should have had every door open for them, struggle just to find work, to keep food on the table. I tried to help where I could, but I always felt like it wasn't enough." He paused, then gave a small shake of his head. "And then tonight happened, and I realized I hadn't been doing nearly enough." Daniel shifted his weight slightly. "You did more than most." "That's not good enough," Harrington said. "I own more than just this store. I have influence, connections, and I've decided I'm going to start putting them to better use." Daniel arched a brow. What exactly does that mean? Harrington reached into his pocket, pulled out a small business card, sleek and professional. He extended it to Daniel, who hesitated before taking it. "Carter," Harrington said, his voice steady. "I'm hiring." Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "Hiring?" "I have a security division," Harrington explained, "and not the kind that hires guys like Rick. I hire professionals, men who know what it means to be disciplined, trained, reliable. I started it years ago, mostly hiring former military, but we always need good people. And from what I saw in there," he smirked slightly, "you're the kind of man I'd want watching my back." Daniel stared down at the card, running his thumb over the embossed name. It wasn't just a job offer, it was a lifeline. Something inside him tightened, an instinctual hesitation. He had been out for a long time, living day to day, figuring things out on his own. Could he really step back into something structured again? Harrington seemed to sense his hesitation. "No pressure," he said. "You take your time, but when you're ready, give me a call." Daniel looked up at him, the man who had stepped in when no one else would. He gave a small nod, tucking the card into his pocket. "I'll think about it." Harrington smiled. "That's all I ask." The two men stood there for a moment in the cold, neither saying much more. It wasn't necessary. Finally, Harrington gave a sharp nod, then turned and headed back inside. Daniel watched him go, feeling something stir deep in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Act 4. A new direction. Daniel walked down the quiet street, the weight of the new coat settling into his shoulders. He hadn't realized how badly he had needed it, not just the warmth, but the reminder that people like him weren't forgotten. As he turned the corner, his boots crunching against the pavement, he heard his name again. "Sergeant Carter?" He turned to see Emma, the young cashier from the store, hurrying after him, her breath visible in the cold air. Daniel slowed, waiting as she caught up. "What's up?" She stopped in front of him, shifting her weight nervously. I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, "for not saying anything sooner, for just standing there when Rick was..." She cut herself off, looking frustrated with herself. "I should have done something." Daniel studied her for a moment before shaking his head. "You did," he said. "You helped fix it. That's what matters." She exhaled, relief washing over her features. "Well, I still feel bad about it, but I also wanted to say thank you for what you did, for what you've done." Daniel gave a small nod. "You take care, kid." Emma smiled. "You too." As she turned back toward the store, Daniel continued down the street, his mind still turning over the events of the night. This wasn't the first time he had been overlooked, dismissed, disrespected. It was something men like him had come to expect. But tonight had been different. Tonight, someone had stood up. Tonight, justice had been swift. And maybe, just maybe, his future wasn't as uncertain as he had thought. He reached into his pocket, pulling out Harrington's card. He turned it over in his fingers, considering. Then, with a small smirk, he tucked it back into his pocket and kept walking, not aimlessly, not lost. For the first time in a long time, Daniel Carter had direction, and something told him this was only the beginning, the end.